Imagine, for a moment, the beginning of human history. The story we are told is very clear. First, humans learned how to cultivate the land. Then villages were established. Then cities rose. And finally, temples appeared. But a hill in southeastern Turkey shows that something in this story might be wrong, because the structures found on that hill should not exist at all. This place is called Göbekli Tepe. The truths buried beneath this hill have been unsettling the archaeological world for 30 years. Because on this hill stand massive stone temples built about 11,500 years ago, at a time when humans had not even begun farming. Before people had learned to cultivate the soil, they were already assembling gigantic stone pillars. They carved animal reliefs into them and arranged them in a precise architectural order. That means before agriculture, before writing, before the wheel. So if there was no agriculture, no permanent villages, and no established social hierarchy yet, who built these structures? And why? The modern world discovered this mystery almost by accident. In 1994, German archaeologist Klaus Schmidt was conducting research in Turkey. He was walking on a hill near the city of Şanlıurfa in southeastern Turkey. This hill had actually been overlooked once before. In the 1960s, a survey team came here. They saw the stones, but they assumed they were ordinary grave markers and moved on. That mistake would become one of the greatest missed discoveries in the history of archaeology. When Schmidt looked at those same stones, he immediately realized this was no ordinary cemetery. The shape of the stones and the way they were embedded in the ground suggested something much larger was hidden beneath the surface. He began excavations. When the first shovels struck the soil, no one knew history was about to be rewritten. Just beneath the first few centimeters of earth, the clean edge of a carved stone appeared. Then, it became clear that it was a pillar. It was T-shaped. It had been made by human hands. And it was not alone. Another one appeared. Then a circle. Then another circle. As the soil was removed, a vast architectural system hidden underground slowly began to emerge. Interconnected temple enclosures, nested within one another, used for centuries, perhaps millennia, and then mysteriously buried. From that day until his death in 2014, Schmidt spent every excavation season on this hill. He rarely left the site, because every new discovery produced more questions than answers, and each of those questions shook our understanding of the origins of civilization. Today, only about 5% of Göbekli Tepe has been excavated, which means what we see may only be the beginning of the story. And the truly unsettling part is this: a massive portion may still lie hidden beneath the soil. Radiocarbon dating was very clear. The oldest structures at Göbekli Tepe date back to around 9,600 BCE. That is about 11,500 years ago. The shock becomes clearer when you compare timelines. The Egyptian pyramids were built about 4,500 years ago. Stonehenge began around 3000 BCE. The first cities of Mesopotamia and the earliest traces of the Sumerian civilization go back roughly 5,000 years. Now place all of those on a timeline, and then place Göbekli Tepe at the very beginning, not centuries earlier, but thousands of years. Yet the most shocking thing is not its age. It is the fact that these structures should not exist. Agriculture only began spreading across Anatolia and the Middle East between about 9,000 and 8,000 BCE, which means Göbekli Tepe appears to have been built thousands of years before organized farming. For a long time, historians agreed on a simple sequence. First, agriculture, then permanent settlements, then social organization, then monumental structures. A society could only focus on complex construction once it produced enough surplus food. Only when the granaries were full could people carve stones and organize massive projects. When a person is hungry, what do? Spend their last resources on food? Or begin constructing a giant temple? This is why Gobekli Tepe still unsettles archaeologists today, because Gobekli Tepe turns that logic upside down. Here, we find something that should not exist in that era: temples built before agriculture. The basic assumption of the classical theory now has to be questioned. If these structures truly predate farming, then civilization did not emerge the way we thought. Humans did not settle down because of economic necessity alone. Something else came first. And to understand what that was, we have to ask who built these pillars. Perhaps people began cultivating fields not primarily to survive, but to gather around a sacred center. Now imagine that time. Across the harsh plateau of southeastern Anatolia, small groups of hunter-gatherers move with the seasons. They collect wild grains in open fields, follow herds of gazelle, and try to survive the next season. They have no permanent houses, no villages. They move from place to place, finding food according to nature's rhythm. And the evidence suggests that it was precisely these people who built these monumental structures. Of course, not alone. Archaeological remains indicate that hundreds, perhaps thousands of people gathered here during certain periods. The abundance of animal bones, large amounts of wild grain remains, and various stone tools all suggest that groups from distant regions met at this location. But what brought them together? And once they gathered, how did they build such an extraordinary complex? The pillars were not only large, they were heavy. They were carved, transported, erected. So this was not only about belief, it required serious organization. Each of these T-shaped limestone pillars is about 3 to 6 meters tall. They weigh between 10 and 20 tons. The largest ones exceed 7 meters and approach 50 tons. These blocks were cut from limestone quarries several hundred meters away and transported to the site. There were no wheels, no domesticated animals to help with labor, only human strength, stone tools, and a level of coordination we still struggle to explain. In one of the quarries, an enormous unfinished pillar still lies on the ground today. It looks as if the workers simply abandoned it one day. If completed, it would have exceeded 7 meters and weighed more than 50 tons. They never moved that one. But they moved many others, dozens of times, and they did so with astonishing precision for that era. The mystery deepens when you look at the carvings on the pillars: foxes, snakes, vultures, cranes, lions, wild boars. Dozens of animal figures are carved into the limestone with remarkable skill. Each one appears deliberate, controlled, and meaningful. These were not randomly carved stones. They were the traces of a community that shared symbols and shared meanings. Archaeologists are still debating today. How did these people organize such construction? Did they have leaders or religious figures? They managed to gather hundreds of people in the same place. They somehow fed them and directed their labor for months, perhaps years. What kind of authority made that possible? We still do not know. But one thing we can say with certainty today is this: for a long time, hunter-gatherer societies were considered simple. Gobekli Tepe completely destroys that idea. Some researchers propose an even more radical possibility. Perhaps agriculture was not the first step that created civilization. Perhaps people gathered first for ritual, and those repeated gatherings eventually forced them to develop agriculture. In other words, agriculture did not create civilization. Civilization may have created agriculture. Think about it. Large groups of people returning again and again to the same place. they have to be fed. Hunting is not always enough. Gathering wild food is not always enough. At some point, instead of waiting for nature, you begin to control it. At first, this idea sounds strange, but archaeological evidence supports it. Some of the earliest regions where grain cultivation began lie near Göbekli Tepe. Genetic studies show that wild emmer wheat, the ancestor of domesticated wheat, was first domesticated in regions only a few hundred kilometers from Gobekli Tepe. Coincidence? Maybe, but maybe not. If this is true, the opening scene of human history changes. First came meaning, not hunger. First came shared symbols, not necessity. And behind cities, farms, and states may lie a much older impulse: the need to believe together. This is not a small detail. It changes the very first sentence of what it means to be human. Perhaps humans were not first survivors. Perhaps they were first seekers of meaning. And if Gobekli Tepe truly shows this, then the center of human history is not economics. It is the search for meaning. But the strangest part of the story is still ahead. These massive temples were not destroyed by war. They did not collapse in an earthquake. They were not slowly abandoned. The people who built them returned one day and deliberately buried everything. They filled the spaces around the pillars with rubble, animal bones, and soil. This was not destruction. It was a controlled closure. The structures were carefully buried, layer by layer, as if a funeral had been held for a giant monument. Why did they do it? We do not have a definitive answer. Perhaps it was a ritual closing ceremony. Perhaps they wanted to protect the sacred space. Or perhaps they stood on the edge of a much larger transformation. They were burying the hunter-gatherer world and opening the door to the settled one. And perhaps the clearest answers are still underground, because most of the site has not yet been excavated. New pillars will be found, new chambers will be uncovered, and every new discovery will deepen this story, because sometimes a discovery does not illuminate the past. It catches it in the act. But one thing we already know: Gobekli Tepe is forcing us to rewrite the first sentence of human history. Perhaps humans did not begin by farming. Perhaps they began by believing. Perhaps the first great structures were not built out of hunger, but out of the search for meaning. Gobekli Tepe is not just an ancient temple. It is a mirror of humanity. And in that mirror, the first thing we see is not hunger. It is belief.